Picture this. You're a 31-year-old medical professional in 1917 serving in the trenches of World War I. You've always been uncomfortable in tight spaces, but you thought that was normal. Then you're forced to live in narrow, suffocating trenches for months. While your fellow soldiers adapt, you're pacing anxiously, consumed by what feels like trench fever. But here's what's fascinating. This man's fear of physical confinement was just the beginning of a much deeper story about how we get trapped in life. Because what pioneering psychiatrist W.H.R. Rivers discovered in 1917 wasn't just about claustrophobia. It was about how the patterns that trap us in physical spaces are the exact same patterns that trap us in relationships, careers, and entire life paths we never consciously chose. Today, we're exploring something revolutionary. The psychology of feeling stuck isn't just about tight spaces. It's about tight lives. The same unconscious patterns that make someone panic in an elevator are the patterns that keep someone in a soul-crushing job for 20 years. The same childhood experiences that create claustrophobia also create what I call life claustrophobia, the feeling of being trapped in circumstances that feel impossible to escape. We're diving into the most fascinating psychological case studies ever documented, but we're not just talking about physical spaces anymore. We're talking about the invisible prisons we build in our minds, the comfort zones that become cages, and the unconscious patterns that keep us stuck in lives that feel too small for who we really are. Let's start with Dr. W.H.R. Rivers' most famous case, because what he discovered goes far beyond claustrophobia. This 31-year-old soldier wasn't just afraid of confined spaces. He was unconsciously recreating the same patterns of entrapment in every area of his life. And when Rivers traced these patterns back to their origins, he uncovered something that revolutionizes how we understand not just spatial fears, but life fears. Remember that 6-year-old boy trapped against the wall in a box bed with his brother, unable to move for fear of waking him? Rivers discovered that this wasn't just creating claustrophobia. It was creating a template for how this man would approach relationships for the rest of his life. Think about it. A child learning that love means being trapped, that caring for others means sacrificing your own comfort, that speaking up for your needs will disturb the peace. When Rivers analyzed this patient's adult relationships, he found the exact same pattern. The man consistently chose partners and situations where he felt obligated to stay quiet about his needs, where expressing discomfort would disturb others, where he felt trapped but believed he had no choice but to endure. His childhood spatial trauma had become his adult relationship blueprint. But it gets even more fascinating. Remember how he'd witnessed miners descending into that dark, narrow shaft as a child? Rivers found that this man had unconsciously chosen a medical career that often required working in confined, underground or restrictive environments. He was literally recreating his childhood fears in his professional life over and over again, and that memory of being trapped in the alleyway with the rag and bone man. Rivers discovered this had created a lifelong pattern of the man putting himself in situations where escape routes were limited. He would take jobs with restrictive contracts, enter business partnerships with complicated exit clauses, even choose living situations where he felt financially or socially trapped. When the war forced him into trenches, it wasn't just triggering his claustrophobia. It was activating every unconscious pattern of entrapment he'd been living with for decades. His mind was screaming, "This is the story of your life. You always end up trapped with no way out." Here's what's brilliant about Rivers' approach and what makes it relevant to anyone feeling stuck in life today. He didn't just treat the spatial symptoms, he traced the entire pattern back to its psychological origins. When the patient understood how his childhood experiences had been unconsciously directing his adult choices, everything changed. He wasn't just learning to tolerate confined spaces. He was learning to recognize and interrupt the unconscious patterns that had been confining his entire life. This case teaches us something profound about how psychological entrapment actually works. Our brains don't just store memories, they store patterns. That 6-year-old's experience of being trapped and unable to speak up didn't just create a fear of small spaces, it created a neural template that said, "This is how relationships work. This is how work works. This is how life works. You endure discomfort silently because speaking up will cause problems." Think about your own life for a moment. Are there patterns you keep repeating? Relationships where you feel unheard, jobs where you feel undervalued, living situations where you feel stuck. River's work suggests these might not be coincidences or bad luck. They might be unconscious recreations of early experiences where you learned what normal felt like. The most powerful part of this case study is that once the soldier understood his patterns, he could start making conscious choices instead of unconscious ones. He could ask himself, am I choosing this relationship because I love this person or because the dynamic feels familiar? Am I staying in this job because it's good for me or because feeling trapped feels normal? River's patient didn't just overcome his claustrophobia, he learned to recognize when he was about to trap himself in any area of life. He developed what we might call pattern awareness, the ability to notice when his unconscious mind was steering him toward familiar forms of confinement. And that awareness became his key to freedom, not just in physical spaces, but in every aspect of his life. Now let's jump to 1998 and meet a 43-year-old woman who became part of a revolutionary experiment that changed how we understand not just claustrophobia, but how we can practice overcoming any fear that keeps us stuck in life. Her story shows us something incredible. The same techniques that help people overcome physical confinement can help us overcome psychological confinement in relationships, careers, and life choices. Think about the psychological brilliance of what these researchers created. Instead of throwing someone with severe claustrophobia into real confined spaces, which could be traumatizing, they created virtual environments where every variable could be controlled. But here's what's fascinating. This same principle applies to every area where we feel stuck in life. We can practice difficult conversations in therapy before having them in real relationships. We can explore career changes in coaching sessions before making them in real life. We can rehearse setting boundaries in safe spaces before implementing them with difficult people. The treatment protocol was 8 sessions of gradually increasing challenge. Session 1 might have been a large virtual room with wide open doors. By session 8, she was navigating narrow virtual tunnels. But think about how this applies to life changes. Session 1 of overcoming career stagnation might be updating your resume. Session 8 might be actually quitting your job to start your own business. The principle is the same: gradual exposure to increasingly challenging situations in a controlled environment. What makes this case study revolutionary is how thoroughly it was documented. Researchers measured her psychological responses before, during, and after treatment. They tracked her heart rate, stress hormones, and self-reported anxiety levels. But imagine if we applied this same scientific rigor to other areas where people feel stuck. What if we measured people's stress responses to career conversations, relationship conflicts, or major life decisions? What if we tracked their progress as systematically as these VR researchers did? By the end of 8 sessions, all of her claustrophobic fear measures had significantly decreased. But here's the most important part. When they followed up 1 month later, the improvements had held. This wasn't temporary relief. This was actual psychological change. Her brain had literally rewired its response to confined spaces. And this same neuroplasticity principle applies to every area where we feel psychologically trapped. From a psychological standpoint, this case study proved something revolutionary about how our brains process fear and limitation. The woman's mind couldn't tell the difference between a real confined space and a virtual one. Both triggered the same fear response. But because the virtual space was actually safe, her brain gradually learned to update its threat assessment. This is exactly what happens when we practice difficult life skills in therapy, coaching, or supportive environments. Our brains learn that situations we thought were dangerous might actually be manageable. This connects to a fundamental principle that applies far beyond claustrophobia: systematic desensitization. You can't be relaxed and terrified at the same time. These are incompatible psychological states. By gradually exposing someone to their fear while they're in a safe, controlled environment, you can teach their nervous system to respond differently. This works for fear of confined spaces, but it also works for fear of conflict, fear of career change, fear of being alone, fear of success, fear of failure. Any fear that keeps us stuck in lives that feel too small. What's happening in the brain during this process is absolutely fascinating and applies to all forms of psychological change. Each time the woman experienced a virtual confined space without actual harm, her neural pathways were being modified. The connections between enclosed space and danger were being weakened, while new connections between enclosed space and safety were being strengthened. This same neuroplasticity happens when we practice any new life skill. The connections between difficult conversation and disaster can be weakened, while connections between difficult conversation and growth are strengthened. This case study opened the floodgates for VR therapy research, but it also revealed principles that apply to overcoming any form of psychological stuckness. Today, people use similar systematic exposure techniques to overcome fear of public speaking, fear of dating, fear of career change, fear of setting boundaries, any situation where they feel psychologically trapped. The beautiful thing about this woman's story is that it shows us a roadmap for overcoming any limitation. Start small, practice in safe environments, gradually increase the challenge, measure your progress, and trust that your brain can learn new responses to old triggers. Whether you're afraid of elevators or afraid of asking for a raise, afraid of MRI machines, or afraid of ending a relationship that's not working, the principles are the same. Her courage didn't just help her overcome claustrophobia, it helped prove that we can systematically overcome any fear that keeps us feeling trapped. The virtual became a bridge to the real, and the confined became a pathway to freedom. That's the power of understanding that our limitations are often more flexible than we think, and that with the right approach, we can practice our way to freedom in any area of life. Sometimes the most confining spaces aren't physical at all. They're the necessary choices that trap us in lives we never consciously chose. Let me tell you about a case study that reveals something profound about how we get stuck between survival and authenticity, between what we think we have to do and what we actually want to do. A woman with cancer needed regular MRI scans to monitor her treatment, but she had such severe claustrophobia that she couldn't tolerate being inside the machine. Her choice seemed stark: face her deepest fear or potentially die. But here's what's psychologically fascinating. This exact same dynamic plays out in countless lives every day, just without the medical urgency. How many people stay in soul-crushing jobs because they need the health insurance? How many remain in unfulfilling relationships because they can't afford to leave? How many live lives that feel like slow death because the alternatives seem impossible? What happened when she tried to enter the MRI was a textbook panic attack. Her heart rate spiked, she began hyperventilating, her muscles tensed up, and she experienced an overwhelming urge to flee. But here's what's crucial to understand. These same physiological responses happen to people facing any situation where they feel trapped between necessity and authenticity. The person who gets panic attacks thinking about leaving their secure but miserable job. The individual who feels physically sick when they consider ending a relationship that's good on paper but emotionally deadening. The psychologist treating her used cognitive behavioral therapy techniques specifically designed for situations where fear conflicts with necessity. But these same techniques apply to anyone feeling trapped by what they believe they have to do. They started with education, helping her understand exactly what was happening in her brain during panic. Knowledge became power. When she understood that her symptoms were her body's misguided attempt to protect her, she could begin to work with her fear instead of being overwhelmed by it. The treatment involved systematic exposure adapted for her medical situation. They started with photographs of MRI machines, then videos of the procedure, then visiting the MRI room without getting on the table. Each step was designed to gradually desensitize her fear response while teaching her coping strategies. But imagine applying this same approach to other necessary life situations, starting with thinking about career change, then researching options, then having informational interviews, then actually applying for new positions. The principle is identical: gradual exposure to what feels necessary but terrifying. The breakthrough came when she was finally able to complete a full MRI scan. But this wasn't just about conquering a phobia, it was about learning to navigate the space between survival needs and psychological comfort. The psychological intervention had literally made the difference between being able to receive proper medical care and potentially dying from untreated cancer. But how many people are dying slower deaths because they can't navigate the space between financial security and meaningful work, between social approval and authentic relationships, between family expectations and personal dreams? This case highlights something that many people don't realize. The feeling of being trapped by necessity is incredibly common. Studies show that up to 37% of patients experience anxiety during MRI scans. But consider this. Studies also show that over 70% of people feel trapped in jobs they don't find meaningful. Over 40% of married people report feeling lonely in their relationships, and countless individuals feel stuck in life paths they never consciously chose. We're talking about millions of people whose authentic lives are compromised by fears disguised as necessities. The psychological insights from cases like this have actually influenced how we think about necessity itself. Just as open MRI machines and better patient communication protocols emerged from understanding claustrophobia, new approaches to career transitions, relationship changes, and life design have emerged from understanding psychological entrapment. When we understand the psychology of feeling trapped by necessity, we can often find creative alternatives we never considered. What's most powerful about this case is how it demonstrates that what feels like necessity often isn't. This woman's claustrophobia wasn't a separate issue from her cancer treatment. It was a barrier that needed to be addressed for her to receive proper care. Similarly, our fears about career change, relationship transitions, or life redesign aren't separate from our well-being. They're barriers that need to be addressed for us to live authentically. The psychologists who helped her weren't just treating a phobia. They were part of her cancer care team, helping her access life-saving treatment. This is what integrated living looks like when we understand that our psychological barriers and our life choices are intimately connected. Sometimes what we think we have to do is actually what we're afraid to question. And sometimes the most necessary thing we can do is learn to distinguish between real necessities and fear-based limitations disguised as necessities. Her story proves that even when the stakes feel life or death, there's usually a way to honor both our survival needs and our psychological well-being. The key is learning to work with our fears rather than being paralyzed by them, and recognizing that what feels impossible today might become possible with the right support, strategy, and gradual approach. Sometimes the most confining thing isn't the MRI machine or the job or the relationship. It's our belief that we have no other choice. Now let me tell you about one of the most psychologically revealing cases ever documented. A woman who became so afraid of the unpredictable world that she voluntarily confined herself to her bed for years. But here's what makes this case universally relevant. Her story is an extreme version of something millions of people do every day. We create comfort zones that feel like safety, but gradually become prisons that prevent us from living fully. This woman suffered from severe agoraphobia. But remember, agoraphobia isn't really about open spaces. It's about fear of situations where escape might be difficult or help unavailable. It's about the terror of being somewhere you can't control, can't predict, can't manage perfectly. Sound familiar? How many people avoid career changes because they can't control the outcome? How many stay in familiar relationships because new ones feel too unpredictable? How many live the same year over and over because anything different feels too risky? The case study documented how her world gradually shrank. First, she stopped going to crowded places. Then she avoided leaving her neighborhood. Then her house became her boundary. Finally, even moving around her own home felt too overwhelming, and her bed became her entire universe. But think about how this same pattern shows up in normal lives. First, someone stops applying for challenging jobs. Then they stop meeting new people. Then they stop trying new activities. Finally, their entire life becomes a narrow routine that feels safe but slowly suffocates their spirit. From a psychological perspective, this makes perfect sense, even though it seems contradictory. Her bed represented complete control. She knew every inch of that space. She could predict everything that would happen there. And most importantly, she felt safe. The outside world had become so psychologically threatening that extreme physical confinement felt like freedom. But isn't this exactly what happens when we get addicted to our comfort zones? The familiar job feels safer than the dream career. The predictable relationship feels safer than the unknown of being single or finding someone who truly fits. The routine life feels safer than the adventure of growth. What makes this case study particularly heartbreaking is how it affected her relationships. Family members would visit, But she couldn't leave her bed to interact normally. She was physically present but psychologically unreachable. The very thing she thought was protecting her, her self-imposed confinement, was actually destroying her connections to the people she loved. And this same dynamic happens in less extreme ways all the time. The person who's so afraid of conflict that they never express their real thoughts, gradually becoming a stranger to their own family. The individual who's so afraid of failure that they never try anything meaningful, slowly becoming disconnected from their own dreams and the people who believe in them. The treatment for this case required incredible patience and understanding. Therapists couldn't just tell her to get over it or force her out of bed. They had to work within her psychological reality, gradually expanding her comfort zone inch by inch. Maybe the first goal was sitting on the edge of the bed, then standing next to it, then walking to the bedroom door. Each tiny step was a massive psychological victory, and this is exactly how anyone expands their life comfort zone. You don't go from a safe but unfulfilling job to starting your own business overnight. You start by updating your resume. Then you have one informational interview. Then you apply for one slightly more challenging position. Each step builds psychological muscle for the next one. What's happening in the brain during severe agoraphobia is a complete malfunction of our natural safety detection system. Normally, our brains can distinguish between actual threats and safe situations. But in severe agoraphobia, the threat detection system becomes so hypersensitive that everything outside the designated safe space triggers alarm bells. The bed wasn't just furniture, it was the only place her brain registered as not dangerous. But this same hypersensitive threat detection happens in less extreme ways. The brain that's been hurt by job rejection starts seeing all career opportunities as threats. The brain that's been wounded by relationship betrayal starts seeing all emotional intimacy as dangerous. The brain that's experienced failure starts seeing all challenges as potential disasters. The most powerful aspect of this case study is that it shows recovery is possible even from the most extreme comfort zone addiction. This woman eventually learned to leave her bed, then her room, then her house. It took years of careful psychological work, but she reclaimed her life. Her story proves that no matter how trapped someone feels, physically or psychologically, there's always a path back to freedom. But it requires understanding that the thing that feels like safety might actually be the thing that's limiting your life. This case teaches us something crucial about judging people who seem stuck in their comfort zones. From the outside, staying in bed for years might seem crazy or lazy. But when you understand the psychological reality of severe agoraphobia, you realize this woman was doing the only thing her terrified brain would allow her to do. She wasn't weak. She was surviving the only way she knew how, and this same compassion applies to anyone whose life looks limited from the outside. The person who's been in the same job for 20 years isn't necessarily lazy. They might be managing a deep fear of uncertainty. The individual who never travels or tries new things isn't necessarily boring. They might be protecting themselves from overwhelming anxiety. The key insight from this case is learning to distinguish between healthy comfort zones and limiting ones. Comfort zones become prisons when they stop serving our growth and start preventing it. When the bed becomes the entire world, when the familiar job becomes a hiding place from potential, when the predictable relationship becomes a barrier to authentic connection. But comfort zones can also be launching pads, safe spaces where we recharge and prepare for the next expansion, not permanent residences where we hide from life. Her story ultimately teaches us that true safety isn't about avoiding all risk. It's about building the psychological resilience to handle uncertainty while still engaging with life. The goal isn't to eliminate comfort zones, but to make sure they're serving our growth rather than limiting it. Sometimes the most dangerous thing we can do is play it too safe, and sometimes the safest thing we can do is take the risk of living authentically. Let's talk about a case study that hits close to home for millions of people. Someone whose panic attacks were triggered by driving and enclosed spaces, but whose story reveals something profound about how modern life itself can feel like a series of psychological traps. This patient's experience shows us how the spaces we navigate every day, both physical and metaphorical, can become sources of existential claustrophobia. The case began 4 years earlier when this person experienced their first panic attack while driving alone. Picture this. You're cruising down the highway, everything seems normal, and then suddenly your heart starts racing. You can't breathe. You feel like you're going to die, and you're trapped in a metal box moving at 70 miles per hour. That first attack created a psychological association that would haunt them for years. Cars equal danger. But think about how this same dynamic happens with life transitions. One bad job interview creates years of career anxiety. One painful breakup makes all relationships feel dangerous. One financial setback makes all risk-taking feel terrifying. What's psychologically fascinating about this case is how the fear generalized. It started with driving alone, but soon expanded to being a passenger, then to any enclosed vehicle, then to crowded spaces where escape might be difficult. This is called fear generalization. When our brain starts applying the same threat response to situations that are similar to the original trauma. But this same pattern happens with life fears. Someone who gets hurt in one relationship starts avoiding all emotional intimacy. Someone who fails at one business venture starts avoiding all entrepreneurial risks. Someone who gets criticized for being creative starts avoiding all forms of self-expression. The real psychological torture wasn't just the panic attacks themselves. It was the anticipatory anxiety. This person would start feeling anxious hours before they had to drive anywhere. Their mind would create elaborate disaster scenarios. What if I have a panic attack in the tunnel? What if I can't pull over? What if I lose control of the car? This is catastrophic thinking in action. The brain's attempt to prepare for every possible threat, which actually makes the fear worse. And this same pattern shows up everywhere in modern life. Well, what if I quit my job and can't find another one? What if I end this relationship and end up alone forever? What if I pursue my dreams and fail publicly? The case study documented how this person's life gradually became smaller. They started avoiding highways with tunnels. Then they stopped driving during rush hour when traffic might trap them. Eventually they were planning elaborate routes to avoid any situation where they might feel confined. Their fear was literally reshaping their geography. The physical world had become a psychological minefield, but isn't this exactly what happens when we let our fears dictate our life choices? We avoid certain career paths because they feel too risky. We avoid certain types of relationships because they feel too vulnerable. We avoid certain dreams because they feel too uncertain. Our fears start mapping our lives, creating smaller and smaller territories of acceptable choices. The treatment involved cognitive behavioral therapy specifically designed for panic disorder with spatial triggers. The therapist helped them understand that panic attacks, while terrifying, are not actually dangerous. They learned to recognize the early warning signs of anxiety and use breathing techniques to prevent full-blown panic. Most importantly, they practiced gradual exposure, starting with sitting in a parked car, then driving short distances, then gradually increasing the challenge. But these same principles apply to any area where we feel trapped by our fears. We can learn to recognize the early warning signs of life anxiety. We can practice breathing techniques for difficult conversations. We can gradually expose ourselves to bigger and bigger life challenges. This case highlights something crucial about claustrophobia in the modern world, but also about psychological entrapment in modern life. Our ancestors might have worried about cave-ins or being trapped in small huts, but we face spatial challenges they never imagined. Elevators, airplanes, subway cars, traffic jams. Our daily lives are full of situations where we're temporarily confined with limited escape options, but we also face psychological challenges they never imagined. Career paths that require decades of commitment. Mortgages that tie us to locations for 30 years. Social media that makes every choice feel public and permanent. Educational systems that demand we choose our life direction at 18. For someone with psychological anxiety, modern life can feel like navigating a series of potential traps. The beautiful thing about this case study is the outcome. Through consistent therapy and gradual exposure, this person was able to reclaim their freedom to drive and travel. They learned that their panic attacks were not a sign of weakness or danger. They were their brain's misguided attempt to protect them from a threat that didn't actually exist. But more importantly, they learned skills that applied far beyond driving. They learned to question catastrophic thinking in all areas of life. They learn to gradually approach challenges instead of avoiding them. They learn that feelings of being trapped are often more about perception than reality. What makes this case so powerful is how relatable it is. Millions of people have experienced some form of driving anxiety, panic in enclosed spaces, or the feeling of being trapped by modern life demands. This person's story shows that these fears are not uncommon, not shameful, and most importantly, not permanent. With the right understanding and approach, even the most limiting fears can be overcome. Their journey from panic to freedom represents something larger than just overcoming claustrophobia. It represents learning to navigate the complex, often overwhelming landscape of modern life without being paralyzed by fear. It represents discovering that we have more choices than we think, more resilience than we know, and more power to shape our experience than our anxious minds would have us believe. Sometimes the most confining thing isn't the car or the tunnel or the traffic jam. It's our belief that we're powerless to change our relationship with the things that scare us. So what do all these case studies, from the WWI soldier to the VR patient to the cancer survivor to the agoraphobic woman to the panic driver, tell us about the psychology of feeling stuck? When we look at these diverse cases of physical claustrophobia alongside the broader patterns of psychological entrapment, we start to see the hidden architecture of how minds build invisible prisons. First, there's the childhood connection that appears in almost every case of feeling stuck, whether in physical spaces or life situations. The soldier's box bed trauma didn't just create claustrophobia, it created a template for accepting limitation. The same way early spatial fears stick, early life lessons about powerlessness, unworthiness, or danger create neural pathways that influence every major decision we make as adults. A child who learns that speaking up causes problems doesn't just become afraid.